At a time of deep division in today's society, we must come together for humanity's sake. On Can We Talk 360, we strive to stimulate an authentic conversation on issues that affect all of us in an environment of tolerance. I am Eugene Pettis, attorney and community servant. Tune into our discussion to foster a greater awareness of yourself and others. Let's discover how there is strength in our differences and an abundance of possibilities when we stand together as one humanity. Welcome to Can We Talk 360. Today we're excited to have with us Mr. Victor Williams, who is an expert in the area of human trafficking. It's a topic we've all heard about, but seldom have we really gotten into what it's really entails. So I'm excited to have this conversation with Mr. Williams today. He is the founder and president of Quest to Freedom. It's a 501c3 that he focuses and dedicates his time to trying to eradicate human trafficking. He's dedicated to defeating the global issues surrounding human trafficking through a holistic approach to education, awareness, and advocacy. Just to give a little bit of background for Mr. Williams, he's a retired special agent for Homeland Security investigations. While he was active with Homeland Security in 2011 February, he was assigned to a position as special agent in charge of the Miami office of the Human Trafficking Group. In 2012, he was appointed the coordinator for South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force until his retirement in January of 2018. We will talk to Mr. Williams about his organization, that is we will talk to Mr. Williams about his organization of Quest to Freedom and find out more about his very active schedule in this space. But I think first, Mr. Williams, we should kind of define what the topic is we're talking about. When people hear of human trafficking, I think we may be misunderstanding it. So define human trafficking for us.
Yes, Eugene, thank you for having me today. So yes, human trafficking is defined by three words, and those words are force, fraud, and coercion. There are other words like transport, harboring, that goes along with the aiding of the crime. But to have a human trafficking case, you need to have these three elements of force, fraud, and coercion.
And when we're talking about those three, are those three elements of force, fraud, and coercion the same for children as it is for adults?
Great question. No, those elements only apply to adults. So yeah, that's a great question. If you're someone under the age of 18, that does not apply, which goes to kind of like the culture. I like to talk about that in the sense of when we talk about the culture of human trafficking, which I really try to address to change this whole dynamic. When we look at, and I hope I'm not jumping the gun, but when we look at when the first human trafficking laws hit the books, that was in the year 2000, right? So you have these elements. And then it took the state of Florida 16 years to finally pass a law that says no more arresting children under the age of 18 for prostitution. It took the state of Georgia 19 years, right? And you got to like wonder, why is it taking so long when these laws came out, in the year 2000, where it says, the elements of human trafficking only apply to adults. Why it took so long for us to make that ultimate change to say no more arresting kids for that issue.
So between 2000 to 2016, Florida, 2019 for Georgia, continued to arrest children under what was intended to be human trafficking criteria for adults.
Yeah, and I would say, and it's even like in 2012, Florida came out with what they call the safe harbor law, which gave officers other options than arresting children. But yeah, and then I think it's so funny, the year 2016, I think Georgia finally came out with their safe harbor law that gave officers other options than arresting children for prostitution. So, you know, you can see Florida's been at the lead of this issue statewide for a long time. You know, Florida's really been a leader in this space.
Let's look at defining human trafficking. So often people believe, including myself, that when you're talking about human trafficking, you're kidnapping a person and taking them some other place. Right. Is that a proper definition in all circumstances?
No. So when we go back again to the definition, we have those three elements of force, fraud, or coercion, right? Force is obviously I beat you to make you do what I want you to do. Coercion is the threat of hurting you, someone you love. And I normally like to add, if there's someone out there that has a need so detriment to their life, and that detriment could be housing, it could be food, anything that you feel like you need, some people can be exploited for that. So, you know, we have to look at coercion. You know, it's not just the threats, but it's engaging someone's need. Now, when we look at fraud, fraud is the weakest of the three elements, because prosecutors always believe that, like, for instance, hey, come to Florida, be a model, be a singer. And we've actually had cases like that. The person comes down, and when they get here, they go, well, no, we're not going to have you doing that. We want you doing this. Prosecutors always feel like you should be able to walk away. That's why that's been one of the weakest elements. But normally, once they get you in that space, they usually use force and coercion to keep you in that space. So that's the definition of human trafficking, are those three elements. And again, the point that you made out earlier, those three elements only apply to adults. I want to add one more thing to that. So in the beginning of the beginning of the law in the year 2000, and this happened when the United Nations gathered all countries in Palermo, Italy, and said, hey, we have to address this issue of human trafficking. And that's what sparked the United States coming out with their laws, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA, in the year 2000 was the first year. But also I wanted to add something in that law. How do we address this issue? And in that law, we wanted to address the issue by the three Ps: prevention, prosecution, and protection. Prevention, obviously, is what we're doing today, educating your audience about this. Protection of victims that are caught up in this, and prosecuting the perpetrators that commit this heinous crime. So when you look at the TVPA of 2000, that's kind of like a wrap up and what it all came out with. And you could talk a little bit more about it, but that's the basic that I like to remind people of.
When we're discussing human trafficking, are there different types of human trafficking?
Yes, there are. So there are 4 types of human trafficking. A lot of people always think about sex trafficking. That's all we see. That seems to be all the movies we watch. But you have sex trafficking, labor trafficking, debt bondage, and a slash servitude. That's all in one. And then organ trafficking is another form of trafficking. And when we talk about labor trafficking, I want to just mention labor trafficking is 60 to 70% of all trafficking. But we always focus on the sex thing, but labor trafficking is really the leader in all of it.
You said sex, labor, and we're going to get into each of these a little in more detail. You said debt bonding, if I heard you correctly. Tell us what that is.
So debt bondage slash servitude could be like, hey, I paid you money to bring me into the United States. I paid you money to get me a certain job. I paid you money, or you could hire me to come work as a servant, as a maid, as a au pair, babysitter for your house, for your kids. And then now that I'm in that situation, you know, it's like, okay, do I ever pay you back? So you give me a job and you provide me a place to live, you provide me food to eat, and then all of a sudden, you know, when I'm working for you and I get my check, the check is very small because you're taking money out, right? And then what the debt bondage part is that you would never pay back that fine. So traffickers that, you know, so-called helping people come here, helping people get jobs, whatever, and they say, you owe me, you never pay back that debt. So that's the debt bondage. And people believe that they owe that debt, you know? Some people sign contracts and believe that these contracts are legit. But I want to let your audience know, any contract you sign that have an illegal portion to it, that is a criminal thing, those contracts don't really, they're voided. You know, they really don't exist. So it's something people should know.
Certainly, that's really important. When you were describing debt bondage, it made me think about what used to happen in decades past with our agricultural seasonal workers.
Yes.
How, you know, Big Sugar and others would bring in seasonal workers, and by the time they got their pay, they had very little, because what they were eating and living and all of that was already deducted from it. That's a
Right.
form, I guess, of debt bondage.
Exactly. And I like to add something to that, because some of these big companies, how they do that is that how they shield themselves from, you know, trying to be connected to the people that are being trafficked within their organization. So say I'm Big Sugar and I hire you to go out and find people to work for me. And then you're the one that's like, okay, hey, I got this job for you, but you're going to have to pay me this, or you're going to have to pay me that, or whatever. And that way, you know, companies are shielding themselves from knowing exactly what the people are that are trafficked in their organization, what's really happening to them. So it's something to be reminded of, you know?
And it's fortunate on that particular area. I think a lot has been improved, tremendous improvement. You know, you don't see that immigration, if you will, for seasonal workers the way it was in you know, 30, 40, 50 years back.
Well, I want to correct you there. It is
Okay.
still going on, you know.
You still have it out?
Like, yo, it's still out there, and it's not getting any better. Even though there are programs that company can take to, you know, shield themselves. Like they have programs that they can sign up for with the government to say, okay, everybody that's working for me, to make sure that that social security card is legit. You know, their ID is a legitimate, you know, card or information. Because sometimes, you know, people that are caught up in this space, they get false identification to register, you know, and companies aren't doing that work to verify that. And that's where they can really find themselves in trouble, because they're not following up on it.
You mentioned labor is 60 to 70% of human trafficking. Give us some examples. I mean, when I heard that statistic, it was surprising, because we do hear more sensationalism, if you will, of sex trafficking, which gives you the impression it's the dominant type of human trafficking. But you're talking about labor. How does that manifest itself in South Florida?
You know, it's funny because I don't know if you know this or if your audience knows this, but January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, right? And, you know, the month after that, you got Black History Month. And then months after that, you got Cancer Awareness. And maybe a month or so, somewhere in between or after, you have Hispanic Heritage Month. All companies are waving those flags. But nobody ever hears of January Human Trafficking Awareness Month, because in my belief, because the moment a product is made and by the time we buy it, there's some issues going on in there, right? So when I talk about labor trafficking, if you own a cell phone, and you're privileged enough to buy clothes and buy food, you have, and that's including myself, we have a minimum of 40 to 60 slaves working for us. And this is why, in my opinion, human trafficking is the #1 crime in the world. Experts say hands down, it's the fastest criminal program that's going on. Some experts said still drugs are #1, but I have to disagree with that, because not everybody that has a cell phone buy drugs. Not everybody that buys food and clothes buy drugs, right? But everybody has a cell phone, right? A lot of people have the privilege to buy food and clothing. And if you have that many slaves working for you, you know, I mean, hands down, to me, labor, you know, human trafficking is the #1 crime in the world, and just on labor alone.
Let's break it down some, if you will, Victor. Cell phones, we all have them. You go to a mall, you go to an airport, you go anywhere. They're everywhere. what is it about the manufacturing of the cell phone? Where is the labor being
Issues.
taken, being performed? Is it in this country? Is it in another country? Is it being imported here? Tell us about that.
So mainly there's a cobalt is a mineral that goes into making, electronics, batteries, goes into our cell phones. And that mineral is mainly dug up and produced out of the Congo in Africa. And you have families, you have children that are digging this stuff up, only being paid like $1 a week. I mean, they're dying digging up these minerals that goes into the cell phones that we make, for that little bit of money, and just so we can have a cell phone. You talk about, I give you one that's a fun fact. I know when we were preparing, I asked, do you eat chocolate? And this is a great question for your audience. When they eat chocolate, if they're not buying products or buying chocolate or coffee that has a fair trade label on it, then most likely that chocolate is being made. The process is, the first step of that process is starting on the west coast of Africa with a sold child picking a cocoa bean, right? So when we talk about cell phones, it's the minerals and stuff that goes into it that is really the issue that you can see a direct attachment to labor trafficking.
At the end of our conversation, I'm going to get into where do we go from here. I'm not looking to get into that now. But one of the things, just came across my mind listening to you is corporate responsibility. Yes. Update us on, you're not the only one that knows these facts. Tell us what, if anything, is going on to try to get more corporate responsibility, not to continue to enhance the need for slave trafficking to make our everyday products.
Right. So there's before I get into that, the title, what it is now, so you mentioned it, social responsibilities. There were all kind of large, corporations were trying to be social responsible in certain areas, but it's expanded. So we're talking ESG, environment, social, and governing. So say whatever company you own, and I want to be, I'm a potential client of your company. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, Eugene, what steps are your company taking in ESG, environment, social, and governing, making sure that you are whatever business we're about to enter into, your company is developing around that mentality to make sure that the people that you're hiring is doing the right thing, to make sure that your product is, you're thinking about the environment safety, you're thinking about social responsibility, that you're paying people right, and the governance of all of that. So ESG is a really big thing, and we all should ask companies that we're dealing with. We should all ask that question because it's all of our responsibility, because it affects us all, whether we know it or not. We all have a choice and have some connection to all of this.
On the point, it affects us all. We certainly, I think, as you've explained, we certainly all touch and buy products. Right, that's the product or the result of such labor. Exactly. What other impact, if you will, how does it impact our lives? How can we bring that home a little better for people that are the beneficiaries of it to understand it comes at a cost?
And that's a great question, because really it's about education. Nobody really wants to buy products that we know people are dying over. Nobody really, when you talk about the social responsibilities, people don't want to know that, they're responsible for certain things, so the impact, on our safety, on our environment, we want to make sure we're doing stuff that's not hurting our environment, because that all affects us. So that's the impact. As the environment, we're having longer summers, we have melting of our polar caps and the water is rising. And there's some report that says, by 2050, Miami might be underwater. You know what I mean? So these are some of the concerns that we all should have, because we all share this earth together, and so we all can take some responsibilities in the choices that we make. So that's why I really appreciate you having this show and having this content, exposed to your audience, because once we know, the question is, what do we do? But if we don't know, then we don't know,
You indicated earlier that in your experience, given the fact that we all touch a product or products in a given day, you believe that this human trafficking is the number one crime, if you will, in our society, in the world. Let's talk about how many, if you have any numbers. Talk to me about what's the number of cases of human trafficking, and are there difficulties in getting accurate numbers of cases of human trafficking, whether it's labor, sex, debt, bondage, or any of the others? What's the amount of it we have in our society?
Well, I'll start off with some numbers from the State Department, International Labor Organization. They come out with numbers that over 50 million people are trafficked around the world. That means 1 in every 150 person in this world has a trafficking situation. It is, and one of the reasons why this next statement I'm about to make is we have more people in the world. There are more people being trafficked today than ever in mankind. There's more people in slavery today than ever in mankind, because basically human trafficking is a modern day slavery, right? So those numbers should blow us away. Over $150 billion enterprise. And that's just what we think, that's just what we think. So I always say, whatever we think, it is always a lot higher. So one of the questions you ask about statistics, and I think I explained, at one point when we were preparing, one of the issues with numbers is that, human trafficking is not on a police report. We get our numbers from an organization called the PolarisProject.org, who monitors our national hotline, right? And they base their calls on the calls that they receive. That gives us somewhat indicating of what states, like for instance, California is number 1, Texas is number 2, Florida is number 3, and it's been that way off and on for years. Occasionally, Florida would be above Texas because we've done such a great job in educating people in Florida about human trafficking. Again, these calls are going into the hotline that sometimes there's been a shift, between Texas and Florida being number 1 and number 2. And the only way that I feel like we can really get good numbers is to have human trafficking on a police report. Right now, it's not. If I want to know how many robberies are in your neighborhood, it's all electronic because it's on a police report. But more so than getting good numbers, why I think we need to push for human trafficking to be on a police report is because now we have to force law enforcement to learn about human trafficking.
And that's I was going to follow up with you. I've represented law enforcement in years past. I don't do it now. I'm solely in medical malpractice, personal injury area, representing individuals. But when I represented law enforcement, sometimes it was a challenge to get an accurate report, even regarding a car accident. There's always cases out there that the reports may not be totally accurate. So one of the things you think the industry needs is for law enforcement to make note of people they come in contact with that they believe or have confirmed that they're victims of human trafficking.
Right. And, because the reason I say that right now, if I want to know how many, human trafficking cases a certain police department had, I have to go and read those reports and read the elements of it. What happened in this report, right? And then determine if it's a human trafficking situation. But if and I'll be honest, like, when I was an agent before I started working in human trafficking, I couldn't tell you the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling, right? Because I didn't know the elements of this case because I wasn't focused on that. But this is such an important, and again, the number 1 crime in the world that it touches everyone. And law enforcement, I'm not trying to embarrass law enforcement because they take enough beating alone, but it's such a cultural thing, you know, human trafficking, that a lot of law enforcement guys couldn't tell you the elements of human trafficking, right? Because that's not their specialty. But and I think if we had it on our police reports, now I have to know what it is. I might even put it underneath human trafficking, you know, and have the elements underneath that when I'm dealing with a situation, those are the things that I'm looking for, right? And then I know those numbers because not all cases are reported. Not all cases make it to the state attorney or the U.S. attorney's office where you can go there and ask them, hey, how many cases you've done, and get some numbers. But we're missing out on a lot of information because it's not on police reports.
And, you know, most police agencies obviously send their cadets to police school, if you will, an academy. It varies, I guess, from state to state, city to city, how long they have to go, but there are weeks, if not months, of training. Do you know if there's anything in their curriculum that teaches them about human trafficking?
You know, I hear all the time that it is, but I haven't seen it. I hear all the time that they're learning and maybe it's an hour class. You know, this is such an issue that you can't get that. I mean, I've been working human trafficking for 14 years and I'm steady learning. I mean, when I first came to the human trafficking group out of the Special Agent in Charge Miami office, when I first got assigned to that group, you know, I couldn't tell you the elements of human trafficking. It's a process because this is I mean, you really have to learn what this is to understand it. It's not something that's, you know, you could just pick up on a day. And that's one thing I would tell your audience, whatever they learn today, please don't stop Googling, trying to find out information, because this is a process. And in order for us to deal with it right, it requires a change within all of us to get it. And that's a cultural change to some extent to that.
Let's talk about this a little further. How do we as citizens learn to recognize potential cases of human trafficking that may be right around us, within our community, within our organizational structures? What can an individual, neighbor, citizen, parent, all different roles, what needs to be done to get them to be able to recognize potential human trafficking amongst them?
We got to talk about it. We need more. We need every day. Like January to me is just 1 month. Every month is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And I give you a quick example. Say you live next door to, you know, your neighbors, and you see a kid every day working in the yard, doing stuff around the house, but you never see the kid at the bus stop. You never see the kid on the playground. How long would it take for you to look at that situation and go, hey, something ain't right here, let me make a call? Because that's been a real case. How long, if you see an elderly woman, all you see is the elderly woman, she's working, doing certain things, and then at night, something strange, you see her taking a shower or washing herself in the backyard with a water hose. How long would that click into you? And before you go, hey, something is wrong, let me make that call. And then when it comes to parents and their kids, you know, your kids showing up with stuff that you didn't buy. You know, you got kids that are like, my kid's a straight A student, and all of a sudden the grades started slipping and attitudes are changing. And culturally, the first thing would go, hey, kid, what's wrong with you? Instead of going, hey, kid, what happened to you? Because that makes the conversation easier. But it's the cultural things that we're caught up in ourselves that's been so like automatic, we miss these points. You know, with our children, kids are happening like all of a sudden this straight A student is having failed your grades, and we're like, what's wrong with this kid? And blaming the kid. A kid runs away, and culturally we go, the kid's a runaway. We're not even asking the kid why they're running away, but we're labeling them, right? So there's a lot of things that we do. We victim blame. I remember bringing this point to you when we were preparing and saying, like, you know, there are 1 in 3 women that are sexually assaulted, but that's not the reporting progress. Because why? Part of that is because we victim blame. Oh, you shouldn't have wore that dress, shouldn't have been out that late. So when you ask that question, what can we do? That's why I say it takes us to recognize, to be educated about the situation. And then it takes us to take that information and make changes within ourselves so we can see what it really is, so we can act accordingly.
Now, talking about the home dynamic, parents,
Yes.
child, you're seeing some changes. The first thing I heard you say is, let's talk, let's have a conversation.
Yes.
Oftentimes, good, wholesome conversations require a relationship. Probably, too often there's not that type of communication established between parents and their children in some instances.
Right.
But having a relationship where the child feels safe to tell you what's going with he or she, how do you get parents to recognize their relationship, their communication with the children is essential if this child is confronted with something that may not yet be human trafficking, but somebody may be setting the seeds to lead them toward that? How do you impress that upon parents?
I mean, I know we got a lot to talk about, but you're talking about some of the solutions to this issue right there. If children are our future, if they're our future, and we need to prepare them right for this, to change this culture, that means parents, we have to recognize our own issues. We have to recognize our own traumas, because the number one thing that creates human trafficking victims is unresolved trauma. Unresolved trauma creates vulnerability, and traffickers are expert at exploiting other people's vulnerabilities, right? Vulnerabilities. So when you go home, and I tell people, human trafficking victims, and to be honest with you, traffickers, all of them are created in homes all around the world, because parents may not be dealing with their issues that their parents put on them. It's called generational trauma. And if we're not addressing our trauma, then we're putting it on our kids. And so I tell parents all the time.
Explain that for me, Victor. If we're not addressing our trauma, we may be putting it upon our kids. Explain that a little better for me.
So I was speaking to a friend of mine that we recognized that her mother and her father were narcissists, right? And they would take the kids and put the kids against each other. And whatever the reason they are narcissists is some trauma that they brought, that their parents may have put on them, right? That they didn't resolve. So I'm raising my kids, because most of us raise our kids the way we were raised. And some of that was trauma informed, some of that was trauma based. And so we think, well, I'm all right. I turned out all right. Well, this is going to be okay for my kids. So whatever that trauma is, so my friend that we recognize that her mother and her father were both kind of like narcissists, they had 3 kids. And so they would do stuff like talk to this kid about the other 2 kids, and then go to the other kids, and wouldn't have the kids really coming together. There was no cohesiveness to bring. There wasn't no love there to bring. They were only projecting their crap on their kids. They're never wrong. Every time they get into a discussion, the kid is always wrong. And when the kid questions them about something that really confronts their issue, now they get emotional and go, oh, you don't love me, or you're hurting me. So nobody's accepting responsibility of their own action, accountability. So when you got parents that are not acting in that way, what do you think you're giving the kid? Because the kids are supposed to learn from us. But you make a great point in starting this whole conversation. And I tell parents, if you don't create an environment that your kid can trust to come to you and talk to you about whatever they want to talk to you about, you're setting them up, you're making them more vulnerable to the world, right? So whatever that environment is, sometimes I gotta, if my kid telling me the truth about something I don't want to hear, maybe I don't need to react to it, because I want them to believe they can come talk to me. I don't want to judge them. I don't want to punish them. I want them to be able to talk to me and discuss what the issues are. when kids make a mistake, you know, coming from at least my culture back in the day, we easily start to punish the kid or yell at them when really mistakes are about us learning. We should embrace them because they're gonna happen. So let's embrace the mistakes that we made, educate ourselves and learn from them and create a kind of like a culture of mistakes are learning processes, not something that we beat ourselves on and die on. Everybody has failed. Great, you know, people who have reached the highest of society has failed at some point, but they didn't let that failure quit, you know, let them quit in their journeys in life. So when I say parents, you got to create that environment, because if they can't come to you, they're definitely going to go to people that definitely won't have your best interests at heart, like you would as a parent.
And the child's best interests, most
Exactly.
importantly.
That's what I meant. Yes.
Yeah. And when you were on the street, if you will, doing this, heading up the South Florida Homeland Security Task Force, did you see victims that gave that story? You know, where they ask, "How did you get here?" And you'll hear a story. Did it take it back? How often was it going back to the home setting?
You know, I've heard traffickers say this: thank you, dad. Thank you, mom. Thank you, uncle. Thank you, family, for what you did to your child. You made my job a lot easier, you know. And I can tell you cases, like when I retired in 2018, a young lady reached out to me and she called me because, you know, people knew I was in this work. And she goes, my dad trafficked me ever since I was a baby. And I want him to pay, but this young lady was mixed because it was her father. She goes, I don't want to hurt him, but I want him to pay for what he did. And he trafficked her until she graduated high school and was able to run away. But all that trauma that she experienced as a kid didn't take her in great areas. She ended up getting involved in sex work. She ended up getting involved in situations of danger. And the one thing I told her, I said, listen, focus on healing yourself and the rest will work out. Because I couldn't say to her, yeah, you know, come to me, let's give me that information and let's get your dad locked up. This is one of the most important things that when I first started working in this space, we had a term, it's called victim-centered, trauma-informed. The victim-centered mentality is, this is a victim of a crime. And sometimes victims don't want to go to the police. They just need help to deal with their situation. And it was such a fight between law enforcement and service providers, because law enforcement was like, give me your victim, I need to make my case. And service providers like, leave my victim alone, she need to heal. And we had to learn. This was such a learning process for me in law enforcement that we're still struggling with for some, because law enforcement want to get bad guys. Service providers want to provide services to victim to help them heal so they can have a better life. And what we learned from this, what I learned from this experience is you got to be victim-centered, because I can't put a victim on a stand that has not started a healing process. Because once they get on the stand, they can make the case a lot harder, especially when they sitting across somebody that had this power and control over them, one vision of them, and they could just fall apart. So you got to make sure that they're starting a healing process and take that stand when they are ready. That's why when they made these laws, these human trafficking laws in the beginning, one of the most important things that they didn't set a statute of limitations. You could be trafficked 20 years ago. And if you can provide the evidence of that trafficking, you can still hold those perpetrators accountable.
That's good to know. My wife knew we were going to have this conversation, and she mentioned to me within the last couple of days a family that had immigrated to the States,
Mm-hmm.
and people across the street from them started befriending the boys and wanted the boys to spend the night, and more to the point where it advanced to the point where the boys were out in the yard, and they went, and it was one boy that didn't talk. He didn't develop speech. as in retrospect, it's because the boy was being traumatized from such a young age. But when the family was trying to cut it off, they kidnapped the boy from the yard, the youngest boy from the yard. It took him 25 years. He was 20 years in their control. They took him and nobody knew where he was. The family didn't know where he was. He said that he kept the faith from what his mom taught him, and he got away, and he has now completed law school to fight against these types of actions. That's his life's dedication. And that's just this week. So the stories that we're talking about here are everyday stories across the country and within our own community. One of the things that I wanted to ask you was that when you talked about victim blaming, it happens at home, it happens with our systems of justice, whether it's the police wanting to get their case closed, throwing a young person up on the stand where, you know, they're going to be traumatized even more, talking about what has happened to them over the years that they've been victimized. Do you see any improvements on trying to get a coordinated prioritization of victim-centered approach versus, you know, closing the law enforcement case as the priority?
Now that's a great question. So I live in Miami, and the state attorney here is Kathy Rundle, who has, you know, she'll tell you from the moment that she started taking these cases, they had 0 cases up until 2011, 2012, when they started recognizing that this was an issue. Now you ask them now, they got over 1,000 cases because they learn. And one thing that I love about Ms. Rundle is that she's taken some of her attorneys and say, okay, guys, this is all you're gonna do. She created her own task force. This is the kind of attention law enforcement, state attorneys need to address this issue, because if I got to do rape and sexual assault and human trafficking, it doesn't make my learning curve for human trafficking stronger. It makes it longer. And when you can just focus on human trafficking, because it's such a crime within itself, and just to understand the dynamics and the psychology of it and all of it, it demands your full attention to get that quick learning curve. So one of the things that she did for 7 years, if you were a victim in the state of Florida and you were a victim of a sexual crime, especially as a child, and say you got sexually assaulted by 5 guys, and each of these guys had 5 different attorneys, before this case even go to trial, Florida is one of 3 or 4 states that it's a right for the accused to depose the accuser, right? So children that would get raped, children that were being trafficked would have to sit in front of a defense attorney and be asked questions that don't even have anything to do with the case. Do you know how traumatizing that is? We had cases that we didn't want to put kids under and had to plea out the case to a different charge, because we didn't want to put children under that type of situation, let alone adults. But just recently, she kept fighting, and now Florida, and I don't know why it's this age, but we'll take any progress we can get. If you're under the age of 16 and you've been the victim of a sexual assault, you do not have to go through that deposition process anymore. And that is a big win for this types of crime. And I'm glad you brought that up, because people really don't know these things. If you never had to go through that, you don't know. And it's sad because people don't know until they go through it. But that is such a big win for this state to make that change, that it can change a lot of lives and cases.
And you know the consequences of putting a child in a room with a lawyer and sometime with the defendant.
Yeah.
The intimidation factor would make that child not want to participate, make that child not want to tell the truth. They're afraid.
we've had people that have gone, victims that have gone through that process and couldn't go through it and wanted to commit suicide after or tried. Because now they're feeling like this is part of the legal process. Why is this happening? And every time you have to talk about that trauma, it re-traumatizes you. So it ain't helping you. So I'm so glad we got that law passed. But can I go back to one thing when you were talking about families, that I think one of the main solutions of this, and we could talk about it now because I think you know where I'm going with the love word. We could do it now or later.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because when we go back to families, whenever I'm doing, presentations and I got parents, everybody, I don't care if I'm talking to government, I'm talking to schools, I'm talking to companies, I'm going to find parents in that audience. And other than telling parents to create that environment that you should be able to have your kids come talk to you about everything, I then ask parents, what are you teaching your kids about love, right? Because when we talk about love, you can put 100 people in a room, it means 100 different things. But I'm working with believe it or not, this is so amazing. Dr. Sandra Anderson, who was a victim of human trafficking. At 11 years old, she was a victim of human trafficking. But she's overcome and thrived through all that trauma. Now she's a doctor of psychology. She does great work, and her and I are teaming up to bring what I'm talking about into a scientific layout, right? And basically, it's like, parents, what are you teaching your kids about love? We tell them we love them every day. They're victims of trafficking that says, oh, he loves me, but he's having me go sleep with other men. There are people that say, oh, they love me, but they're physically beating you every day because maybe that's what you saw your parents doing. We're a culture, we're a creature of that culture. If that's what you saw love being growing up, then it's okay for people to be disrespecting you, calling it love. And I'm not a religious person, but I'm a spiritual person. But one of the things that we're working on is how are we going to redefine love? Let's have a basic definition of it. And I guarantee you, love is not about how we feel. It's really about what people are doing. And if I can teach my kid what love is for themselves, I take so many of their vulnerabilities away, because when they walk out that door, they don't need to belong to the cool group. They're not looking for love or people to accept them. They don't care what people think about them because they love themselves, right? And if I can give a kid that shield walking out that door, man, we can really do some help to kids and take away those vulnerabilities. Now, trafficking, the movie Taken, yeah, that happens, but it's not the number one way people are trafficked. It's from those unresolved traumas coming out of the homes. So if we can, families start defining what love is, and again, it's not about what you feel, it's really about what people are doing. So if you send that kid out there with love, now they get to set boundaries. You can't speak to me this way. You can't treat me that way. And understand, a boundary is when people cross those boundaries, what's the accountability for that really set the boundary. You can't tell people don't speak to me that way and they speak to you that way and you're still in that relationship, because where's the boundary? So there has to be consequences for boundaries. But people and children, parents have to learn that to give that to their kids. So when I get to talk to kids, I send them home with homework. Go home and ask your mom, what is love? Or your parents, what is love? What does it mean? How do you define it? Because that is the ultimate solution to a lot of the world ills, let alone human trafficking, in my opinion.
And that's such a powerful discussion. That could be a discussion in and of itself, because it has so many components to it. But basically, I hear you saying, as opposed to just sending our child out and let them fend for themselves in the big world, let's equip them for knowing who they are and having the confidence to confront wrong, confidence to confront people that may not have their best interests, and not be susceptible to that. And as you said, it starts from a base of love. That if they're loved at home and they're taught what love truly is, they won't get suckered into some artificial love out in the world.
Right. Because just to add, because look, if you're with your parents every day, you're gonna create some emotional bond, right? If you're with a trafficker every day, you're creating an emotional bond because he is keeping you alive, although he's risking your life every day that he or she sends you out to have sex or throw you out in that field, you know, with strangers. But at the end of the day, that person is providing cover, food, something for you. So you'll create that emotion. It's like the Stockholm syndrome, right?
That's the feeling part.
Yes. So that's what I'm saying. Like it, and we confuse the feelings for love. So we can have emotional connections with a bunch of people. But the question is, what is the physical connection? What are the actions behind that physical connection? Because all that is just an emotional attachment. It is not love. But culturally, that's what we get caught up in. Because we're not talking about true love. We're only talking about, yeah, I got these deep emotions. Oh, that's love. Nah, that's just deep emotions. You know what I mean?
I'm smiling because, you know, we start early. I remember in early grade school, you'll write, "Do you like me?" You know, and you're getting into that feelings thing, and that's what we teach. Rarely do you start talking about, you know, I have two beautiful daughters. Together we have four daughters, and it's even at their mature age, at different stages of their lives, of mid-20s into the 30s, you want them to recognize a true person that loves you treats you a certain way. Yes. And if he is not willing to treat you that way, it's not love.
Right.
You know, and that's children who are grounded, you know, and mature. It's still a lesson to be told.
But that point is, I gotta love myself because I always said this, people will treat you how you allow them, but I saw something the other day that had a really good rhyme to it. Maybe it'll come to me. But if I don't love myself, then yeah, I'm opening the door for you to treat me any kind of way. But if I love myself, again, it goes back to now I'm setting boundaries that you can't treat me this way, you know? And I was having a conversation with a friend that she was telling me about. She was in a 3-year relationship where, you know, her and her friend would go out to dinner, and he would always say, "Oh, my girlfriend doesn't cook for me. Oh, my girlfriend doesn't do this for me." And she was like, "Yo, why are you bringing our business out to everyone?" And he kept doing it. But again, a boundary isn't a boundary if you let people continue to cross it without them holding them accountable. So yeah, I mean, that's a great point in the sense that love isn't love. You got to love yourself in order to get love.
Yeah, that's powerful. We got about 5 minutes. Let me ask you some questions. You touched on prosecutors having a role in being educated. That's a big part. I mean, across the state of Florida, you talked about State Attorney Rondo down in Miami. We have what, 63 prosecutors across the state. No, that's counties.
Oh, we got 67 counties. Yeah,
67. 67 counties. Somehow, if you could start educating them on this, you know, that would be a real big advancement. But my overall question to you now is, where do we go from here? Number one, education, continuing education. Tell us about that.
Well, education addresses one of the main P's, right? The 3 P's: prevention, prosecution, and protection. Prevention is the number one of them all. Because if we can educate and prevent, then I don't have to have protection for victims. Then I don't have to prosecute people, because now we're sending our kids out there that are, you know, changing the culture and how we see this. And I'll throw this in, you know, Vic Williams wasn't always, you know, there's a post-human trafficking Vic and a prior human trafficking Vic that was raised as a male in America and did a lot of stupid things. And I give you one example. when I'm talking to people out, when I got audience, I normally ask people, how many of you dressed up for Halloween? Oh, everybody raised their hands. Then I go, well, how many of you dressed up as a prostitute or pimp or attended a pimps and hoe parties during Halloween? Maybe I get the little alligator arms if I get that. But in my next slide is a picture of me in a pimp outfit to bring a point to people that when I educate from this space, I'm educating from my learned experience, not as a victim, but someone who have learned and acted on these words that I've learned. And I've always said if most men could know what I know, but chose to act on it, we can change this in a snap. So where do we go from here? It is always the education. It's not, well, it's not just the education. It's the education and actions. Once we learn, what do we do?
And somehow our education is, we need education at home, but you touched upon earlier the generational concerns. Sometimes home is not the most wholesome place to be put on the right track. We need to find a way to have it within the school setting at the appropriate age. You know, we're battling over what age is educate X, Y, and Z topics, but at some stage, having some of that as a part of, and I don't even know if they have sex education classes anymore in schools. I've been out of it for quite a time, but it doesn't have to be about sex. It needs to be about love. Think of a class on what true love is. And to just get people to start exploring that, how many pitfalls could be avoided?
Oh my goodness. You know, I don't, you know, I had to be told that whenever I say that question, it's because it's so uncomfortable to even throw that word out because it's so misused and we all know it. And to mention it seems a little awkward sometimes. But I know in the state of Florida, I was just in a class the other day where we supposed to be teaching this to our kids. Now, the last couple of days, I've been with 2 educators and I asked, hey, they teaching this in your cool? Nope. Now, Florida, again, being a leader in this space, passed laws that doctors and nurses have to learn about human trafficking. They have to get that CME, but we haven't forced that on our teachers yet.
Yeah.
Okay? And anything that we're teaching our kids, it needs to be backed up with reinforcement shown. Like, for instance, I do a course in behavior management, which basically talks about, are we reacting in life? Because that's all emotional. Or are we responding in life? And there's no need of me, well, I can teach this kid about this, but if it's not being reinforced by teachers and parents, it's not going to go anywhere because that's what we end up doing. We do a lot of reacting in life instead of responding, which is another cultural thing that we need to address.
Right. This is a topic, Victor, that I wanted to bring. As you know, I heard you speak before the Boule sometime last year. Your passion exudes from every word you speak. And it's a topic that I thought needed to come, be brought to every audience that we could possibly create. Not just mine, but every place we can have this conversation. I think it's so vital because it's not over there where there's trafficking. It's where we are. And that's the piece that I didn't understand, and I don't think most people understand. It's not, it happens to those people. It could happen to any of us, any of our children, any of our grandchildren, any of our nieces, nephews, friends, etc. So it's something that we need to talk about. And I look forward to bringing you into different environments, youth groups, church youth groups, that need to have, wherever you can got a congregation of kids that you can educate them on how to be stronger individuals, the conversation need to be had. So I want to really, really thank you for your time. And I want to thank you for your commitment. You spent however many 10 or so years, in the task force, but you've made it your life's mission. And we need more people like you to turn this evil around. So thank you very much for coming on Can We Talk 360.
No, and thank you for seeing this issue such an importance to bring to your audience. And I hope, you get some positive feedback that this really helped and we can do it again.
Absolutely. I would look forward to having you to come back at another time, and we'll look at it from a different angle, and hopefully you can give us some updates on how we've made better progress in this society.
Yes.
I appreciate you, my friend.
Thank you, Eugene. Pleasure.
The law firm of Halitzer, Pedersen Schwam is a proud sponsor of the Can We Talk 360 podcast. Our firm handles medical malpractice, wrongful death, and catastrophic personal injury litigation. We pride ourselves in being advocates for justice on behalf of those who have been seriously injured. For decades, we've taken the lead in making your case our priority. It's who we are. It's who we'll always be. Halitzer, Pedersen Schwam. Serious injuries, proven results.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Can We Talk 360. I sincerely hope that you were inspired to seize this moment in time and take real action towards change. Remember, all change begins with a conversation. Be sure to tune in every month for more fascinating discussions and motivational food for the soul. Please share with your friends, family, and colleagues. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Can We Talk 360, and visit us on the web at www.canwetalk360.com.